sont comme le bon vin, ils donnent de la joie ou bien du chagrin. Affaibli par la faim, je suis malheureux. Pas longtemps chemin, tout ce que je peux, car rien n'est gratuit dans la vie. L'espoir est un plat bien trop vite consommé. À sauter les repas, je suis habituée. Un voleur solitaire et triste à nourrir. Un jeu si amer, je ne peux réussir, car rien n'est gratuit dans la vie. Jamais on ne me dira que la course aux étoiles, ça n'est pas pour moi. Laissez-moi vous émerveiller et prendre mon envol. Nous allons enfin nous régaler. La fête va enfin commencer. Sortez les bouteilles, fini les ennuis. Je dresse la table de ma nouvelle vie. Je suis heureux à l'idée de ce nouveau destin. Une vie à me cacher et puis libre enfin le festin est sur mon chemin. Une vie à me cacher et puis libre enfin le festin est sur mon chemin.
Lately, I've been losing sleep, dreaming about the things that we could be. But baby, I've been praying hard. Said no more counting dollars, we'll be counting stars. Yeah, we'll be counting stars. I see this life like a swinging vine, swing my heart across the line. In my face is flashing signs, seek it out and ye shall find. Old, but I'm not that old. Young, but I'm not that bold. And I don't think the world is sold, I'm just doing what we're told. I feel something so right, doing the wrong thing. And I feel something so wrong, doing the right thing. I could lie, couldn't lie, could lie. Everything that kills me makes me feel alive. Lately, I've been losing sleep, dreaming about the things that we could be. Baby, I've been praying hard. Said no more counting dollars, we'll be counting stars. Lately, I've been losing sleep.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those tuning in for the first time, welcome to the 7th edition of Angel Rising. Yesterday was filled with insightful, honest conversations. We talked about the production value chain, the role of investors in the industry, and we wrapped up analyzing the present and the future of the Saudi agri-food tech ecosystem. The panels got everyone thinking about what their role in this industry is and how we can take action now. And we were very happy to see you, the audience, chiming in with all types of comments and questions and ideas. Please keep contributing to the conversations today. Today, we're going to continue this 2-day journey, diving deep into 2 complex topics: The first panel will discuss the crucial role of traceability and how can we leverage technology to understand where our food comes from and its conditions. And the second panel will be a meaty conversation on cellular agriculture. We will hear from global investors and founders the how and why they invest and produce meat and dairy products in their labs. I hope you all are ready for the second and last day of Angel Rising. I'm going to hand it over to Greg Ohanesian, who will moderate the first panel. Take it away, Greg.
Thank you so much, Lola. And thank you to everyone at VentureSouq and startAD for putting on another fantastic edition of Angel Rising. Today, we have an incredible lineup of speakers to talk about what many may find an incredibly unsexy topic. The food supply chain is something that's generally pretty hidden from everyone's view from a consumer perspective, and thus may not be top of mind for investors. And we wanted to take the next 40 minutes or so to shed some light for those investors. And I think I would love to start with the man who does definitely not find supply chains unsexy because he is the managing director of the Working Capital Fund, which is focused on supply chain innovation, Ed Markham. Ed, thanks so much. Can we kick this off with just a little bit about why traceability is important in the food system and in our supply chains?
Yeah, great. Thanks for your comments. And yeah, I tend to think it's a relatively sexy topic, but maybe we'll see if we can change some minds by the end of today's panel. Yeah, so I'm a managing director of Working Capital. We're an early stage venture fund that is focused on with a relatively unique thesis, which is trying to get better visibility into the extended supply chains of multinational companies. And it's based on, an overall thesis, which I think you kind of alluded to up front, which is that in today's global economy, you've got very, sort of specialized firms. You've got outsourced production, distributed production. That leads to a lot of complexity. And in that complexity, you have a lot of opacity. And so you basically have very, very limited visibility into who's in your supply chain, what actions they're taking. And in that opacity, a lot of bad things happen. That can be related to, food security and safety. That can have adverse outcomes in terms of your ability to understand your risk of supply chain disruptions. That can have, bad sort of outcomes with respect to environmental degradation. And in our case, that can also be, something that allows for lack of accountability with respect to labor practices in the supply chain. So important because, and a need for traceability and transparency in supply chains in large part because of the way production is, distributed and the way that business is done today, essentially. And in our case, then again, food and commodities are at the base of the supply chain. They're large scale. They're often where the greatest opacity exists, and they're often where the most severe abuses occur. And that really occurs across commodity geography and different food commodities. So, whether that's cocoa coming from West Africa, palm oil coming from Southeast Asia, seafood coming from Southeast Asia, coffee coming from various parts of the world, Central America, et cetera. You have, this inability to know exactly what's gone into the production process, and the consequences that a lot of goods that you and I purchase on a day-to-day basis have some tainted supply in them. And so the need to better understand who's in the supply chain, what's going on, still remains a significant problem for corporations, and ultimately something that I think both investors and consumers are increasingly, asking for, more assurances, higher quality verified claims about how production processes take place.
Awesome. Yeah, so it covers a lot. It covers a lot from risk to inability of seeing what's actually going into the production, and it's just a lot of opacity, right? And the more we desegregate, the more opaque that whole thing becomes. Thank you for that, Ed. And I wanted to turn next to Fahim Al-Qasimi. who's the co-founder of FoodTech and a good friend. Good to see you, Faham. And so FoodTech is a traceability in the seafood space. And what made you want to start up in that space? And from your perspective, like, why do you think that FoodTech or any other startup in supply chain transparency is investable?
I think we have to go all the way back to where we started, and why we started the company. And a lot of it will echo, Ed, what you had said about supply chains. A friend of ours had an oyster farm, and he was suffering with the fact that the opaque supply chains meant that whatever he was growing an oyster, at what cost he was growing an oyster, was he wasn't seeing the windfall in the supply chain. Everybody else further down the supply chain was making money. And Sean Dennis, my co-founder, over a dinner said, well, a marketplace would sort that. And my ears pricked up, and I thought this would be interesting. With my background, Greg, I went straight down the rabbit hole of trying to find all the data that I could about what it would take to build a seafood marketplace. Traceability wasn't at the core, I think, when we first started. The world wasn't ready for it. We have, realized that it has become front and center of our value proposition. Let's talk very briefly about why seafood, because there are three unique challenges with seafood rather than any other food product. Number one, 50% of the seafood that we eat is farmed. The remaining 50% is still capture fisheries or wild caught. It is the only food product that we extract from the earth. It is more similar to mining or hydrocarbons than it is like farming beef or vegetables. The second part is that we don't treat seafood the same way as we do other proteins. My challenge, and I've said this for 3 years now, so forgive me if you've heard it before, is if you ask a waiter where that steak came from, with a little bit of research and speaking to the chef, he'll tell you the name of the farm, maybe even the farmer. But when it comes to a piece of salmon, we sort of blanket it with some country of origin. We don't ask the same amount of detail that we do around other proteins. The last part is that it's such an old industry that hasn't had much technology invented for it. These are industries that are widely spread across the earth. As Ed mentioned, from Southeast Asia all the way to South America, that are at very different levels of maturity. And a rising tide has not lifted all ships in that industry. And there's a lot of inequity, I think, in the seafood supply chains today. So opacity in the supply chain is a huge thing that we try to tackle. Our marketplace proves provenance, but also proves where that fish moves in the supply chain. When you buy a piece of seafood through FoodTech, not only do we provide you all the information from the provider, but we also then show you how that has moved through the supply chain through different hands, hopefully very few, before it ends up with the end consumer. The second challenge that we face really with those supply chains is then the equity, which is how do you get new products to new markets where the fishermen themselves, for example, and this is a project we launched in Oman, are actually seeing the biggest value transfer in that supply chain. So that's a big part for us that we're really excited about, and allowing that equity to be sort of redistributed. And then last but not least, and then from a food security perspective, Ed, I promised I would echo a lot of what you said, is supply chains have been tested and shocked in the 3 years we've existed, from Brexit, the US-China trade spat, now Ukraine, COVID. We've seen all sorts of supply chains shift. And I think transparency that we build in the supply chain, not only on the marketplace, but also, within the product, creates a lot more resilience. And that resilience was shown in the fact, for 3 weeks in COVID, we were the only firm bringing in sea bass and sea bream. That's a huge shock to an economy like the United Arab Emirates. And was pretty exciting. So in a nutshell, why is it investable? I think there is a transaction at the core. I think if you focus on the transaction in the supply chain, then there is an opportunity to see that, to have that visibility on the supply chain, and then take a percentage or a fraction of that transaction. And then the second part is that it's investable. And remember, I was the founding investor in FoodTech. It's investable if you stay very concentrated. There are a lot of traceability plays out there, but it is a very much a, who can raise the most amount of capital and who can market it the best in terms of adoption. We're far more focused on saying we're really great at seafood. Maybe we'll talk about the other challenges in other industries later, but that's where we know we can win. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And hearing you talk about that, Faham, I start to think about the other side, the upstream side of the supply chain. You're clearly focused on the consumer side and traceability requirements there, and how that can create efficiency. But I wanted to turn a bit to the production side. And to talk about that, wanted to introduce Francisco Jardim, who's a managing partner at SP Ventures. And if you have a look at SP Ventures' portfolio, you see that there's a lot of a focus on the producers themselves. There's a number of companies that are working on everything from financing options to inputs. And Francisco, I just wanted to give you the chance to talk about that side, which we may not see as much, right? So what are the challenges that producers themselves are facing in their supply chains, and what are the solutions that you're seeing come out of the market?
Hi, Greg. Hi, fellow panelists. First of all, it's an honor to be here out of San Francisco. It's an interesting week because this is the first week that the World Agri-Tech Forum has joined again after 3 or 4 years, and the event is its biggest ever. So we see the innovation ecosystem from inside the farm gates, which is the topic, really thriving back after a couple of years of just being long distance and absent. So first thing we'd like to do to answer that question is to demystify what is the production process, behind the farm gate. So most people don't see farming as a manufacturing operation highly exposed to biological risks and biological activity, be it in plant growth, be it in pathogen attack, be it attack to caterpillars, also highly exposed to climate risk, which has always been a key variable of agricultural risk. And the only certainty that we all know is that it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And on top of this, it's very capital intensive. Whether we're looking from a working capital, you have to buy inputs, prepare your soil, wait several months, and then being able to collect your output. So it's highly capital efficient, or highly capital intensive from a working capital perspective, and it's capex intensive. I mean, you have to buy land, you have to buy expensive machinery, you have to buy infrastructure, warehousing, etc. And there's several risks involved in this transaction besides the ones I mentioned, which are commodity volatility risks. So right now we're going through a major commodity shock with the Russia-Ukraine situation. We went through several other ones with the pandemic, and it's been a recurring. So it's one of those things, it's a supply chain shock, but we've been having supply chain shocks constantly in agricultural commodities over the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? There was a big one back in 2001, 2002, post September 11th, when the US shifted strongly towards ethanol production based on corn and completely changed the dynamics of the corn price. So, I mean, it's an intense, risky activity that has always had a lot less technological tools than most manufacturing operations, if you look at the SMEs business. So our focus has been to back founders and entrepreneurs that are bringing technologies in Internet of Things, cloud, biotech for substituting chemicals, marketplace, fintechs for ags that can finance with cheaper rates farmers that have more sustainable practices. And what we notice is that if you need to approach all of these different angles, supply chain technologies for marketplaces, fintech technologies through these ag fintechs, biologics, and substituting the different inputs. Otherwise, you're not going to get to a more resilient supply chain, a more traceable supply chain, and eventually be able to have a more just supply chain where you don't concentrate the amounts of wealth being created in specific areas of the food and supply chain. So I think that's a general angle that we see. There are three major sticking points that have made farming inside the farm gates not be disrupted by digital technologies. One is the logistic aspect of it. So it's very difficult for you to bring digital technologies for solving the logistic distribution. The second is the technical assistance. So the traditional bricks and mortar retailers have brought a lot of technical assistance to the operation, and that has been tough to digitalize as well. And third is the financing, because of the elements that I mentioned. But all of these three elements are coming on board digitally very strongly right now, and they're starting to fuse. So I think that's a little bit of the panorama, and we've been seeing major entrepreneurs solving all of these challenges, and we believe that the time is quite ripe for this digitalization to happen.
Yeah. No, amazing, and it's really interesting that you brought up. I mean, the rather obvious climate risk that farmers face. I mean, that's for the last 12,000 years that has been an issue for farmers, knowing when the rain will come and when it won't. But obviously, those climate risks are getting worse, and we've talked about the opacity in the system, the risk of disruptions, how we can create greater transparency in that supply chain for consumers. But ultimately, I wanted to kind of look at the bigger picture and see the context that our food supply and our food systems sits within, which is the climate and this planet Earth. And for that, I want to turn to Catherine Foster, who's advisor at Social Alpha Foundation, and has quite an illustrious career, a former diplomat, and has run across the full gamut of topics, and with a lot of focus on carbon and climate change. So Catherine, I just wanted to ask you if you had some insights on the other metrics that we're missing, that not just the transactionary metrics, but what are the climate metrics, the carbon footprint that we should be looking at and embedding within this move towards a more digitized and transparent supply chain.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you. So first, I want to preface this by saying, as a diplomat, I was a climate diplomat, but I also was, started my my work in international trade, opening up the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement, Environmental Side Agreement, and did commodities trading or disputes between the US and Canada, including on salmon, on cod fisheries, on agriculture and forestry. So seeing the policy impacts and the movements and the impacts that had even 30 years ago was quite, really did lead me to think more holistically and systematically about our international supply chains, including on food. And then when I was with the EU climate kick, there, the EU decided back in 2009 to open up these knowledge innovation communities and to fund thousands of startups and partnerships. And I'm now a board member with its sister organization, EIT Food, which is focusing on, consumer behavior, consumer trust, but digitalization and entrepreneurship, food loss, food waste, food production, food technology in this systemic way, because in order to have a healthy, healthy population and healthy earth, what we're talking about here is policy drivers, consumer drivers, supply chain drivers, and it comes down to availability of data, right? And we talked about some of that legacy data and things that happen on the ground, and how we're in a capacity now where we can capture a lot of this. And I've worked with a number of startups directly, including on value chain traceability. And these were always the biggest hurdles. We have the capacity to innovate. We have the capacity also to open up, not just the traceability side of things, but to open up funding mechanisms, to open up and understand, human rights and labor, as well as environmental impacts. And that data that's becoming more readily available and systematically sort of aggregated, it's the aggregation of that into capacity for climate markets and footprinting that is really exciting for me. And what this means is that under the climate chain, under the voluntary markets, for example, we can actually now, and I'm working with a few organizations doing this, actually aggregate some of the innovative technologies and programs out there and initiatives and startups out there into sort of the clusters. And we have food labeling capacities that can also be integrated there for understanding the footprint of the carbon footprint, but these other values as well. And what this means is that we're able to aggregate this and create sort of a new level of marketplace for investors and for innovators themselves. So it's really opening up vast opportunities across the value chain. And then by this, I don't mean just the food value chain. I mean the policy right through to the carbon markets and financing that's becoming available. So we can actually link into on the ground, smallholds farmers and small fisheries, etc., and actually innovate around financing and investing. So I'm just going to leave it there, and we can dive deeper.
Yeah, no, that's I think music to everyone's ears, especially for me. I think starting up Summa Mater was purely about the lack of data transparency that we see in the Middle East, and I think I am hopeful that can be grown and expanded, and we're seeing all the work that's being done towards making that a true fact on the ground, and tying everything in through from policy pathways through to investors and action on the ground. So thank you very much for that. So with that, on a positive note, I wanted to open up the discussion and actually get everyone talking to each other on this panel. And I wanted to kick that off with a question, right? So we've looked at what are the challenges that we're trying to address through supply chain transparency and traceability. But we know that there are some big issues on the ground and a lot of hurdles to achieving that across different geographies and across different sections of the supply chain. If anyone was around for day one of Angel Rising, Heather Henyon mentioned something really interesting around what smart capital in alternative meats really means and what smart capital can do. And her answer was really around pushing them towards favorable regulatory markets, right? So rush to Singapore for the time being. So in that same sort of thread, what does smart capital look like in the supply chain space, and what do startups need investors to be like to support them in, and what's that ecosystem of support? What are the challenges that they're facing in actually getting the job done, right?
I can jump in there initially. I mean, I think there still are many gaps in the system, and part of the way that we think about what would be end-to-end transparency, and when you speak to corporations, that's often what they complain about, is their inability to get end-to-end transparency. I think we think about it, I think in a somewhat similar way to some of the things that Catherine was mentioning, which is data and data flow, and where are those different gaps. And so fundamentally, there's still a significant gap at capturing high quality information at source. And through geospatial technology, IoT devices, crowdsourcing, in our case, worker information through cell phones, et cetera, there are now ways that you can actually begin to populate that with meaningful data. But if you don't have meaningful data, it's going to be garbage in, it's going to be garbage out at the end of that process, right? And so you then also see people taking that data, and there's a lot of verifiers, whether it's blockchain technology or otherwise. So if someone makes a claim, can that be substantiated in a meaningful way? And then you look at the next stage of that, which is there are people who are taking information, often high quality information, verified information, analyzing it, trying to make it so that you can have actionable insights. If you're someone in a responsible sourcing role in a company, you're trying to decide between multiple suppliers, and you try to figure out which one of them are making a claim that is legitimate, verifiable. And then the last piece of that we look at is the ability to communicate that externally. Again, there are a lot of increasingly greenwashing laws that are emerging in the UK, the EU, where if you make a statement, you have to be able to verify that, you have to be able to back it up. And so there's a need for consumers, ESG investors, et cetera, to have confidence in what kinds of claims are being made. And so if you look at that flow, there are gaps and there are problems throughout. It does ultimately start with high quality information at the beginning, but there still are challenges through that kind of data pipeline.
Please, Catherine.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, I think from the outset, around blockchain and emerging technology, my calling card has always been, please, let's not assume that anything is ready to plug and play. This is hard graft. This is hard work that we have to do to make more systemic data policies and capturing guidelines. And I think this is where some of those drivers are really helping us to do so. So this is not going to be an overnight answer at all. And especially in areas where data is, we have sensors across all farms, farming commodities for fields, for the commodities, for the tractors, for, satellite imagery, so much has changed very quickly. But all of this has been built out in competition. And I think that I hate to use the C word here, but this is where programs like the Climate Kick and EIT Food, where you can actually bring some of sectoral partners together to overcome some of those gaps, to discuss some of these hurdles around readily available data, how to aggregate it, how to actually make it meaningful across multiple users, because that is really key. And then also for educational and policy factors, it's really essential. So I think for me, in terms of investments, understanding that this is perhaps a slower burn. This is going to be not an overnight windfall, but it is something that is absolutely necessary, and the impact measurements are there. It's really about getting them into a format and communicating them and being able to aggregate them into the financial framework as well.
Yeah. Francisco, do you disagree?
I'd pick up where Catherine left off. I think this is a sector that the cycle of maturity is longer. The access to capital is not as obvious as many other consumer technologies. So what we've been doing here is trying to raise significantly corporate venture capital for our founders who are tackling this problem. As we've seen supply chains, investors such as the ABCDs, the ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Dreyfus trading companies, and many other Asian companies, they've had to get involved because they're key elements of the value chain where you have significant infrastructure for logistics. And if you don't get that infrastructure on board, whether it's ports, railways, et cetera, it's very difficult to guarantee integrity and the traceability. So getting these big guys on board, not only as value add partners, but especially as equity partners, investing and getting their innovation programs going has been an important factor. I think that's been a key element of success in the smart capital category.
Awesome. Faham, did you had something to add there?
I did. As the only startup here, I want to offer maybe a little bit of a contrarian view and maybe bring a little bit of realism to it. I think, and I'm saying this purely to be facetious and contrarian, but I think, your vantage point as investors and policymakers is very utopian. I think when you're on the ground and you're in emerging markets, you struggle with challenges that are far more basic. I operate in fish. When I talk about data, we have governments that don't have any information on the fish that they catch. And we're building, our trace product is three things. It's supply chain trace visibility. It's a procurement tool. We have large hotel groups, international hotel groups that use it to sort of understand how much they're procuring. And then, Greg, as you mentioned earlier, yes, it is this end user tool that for us just helps us explain what we do a little bit to the layman, right? We're not a B2C business. We're a B2B business. But we, that product can actually have some great impact. But let me tell you about Oman. Oman is a wonderful country that is so rich with seafood, that has a challenge of collecting information because the majority of the fish is actually caught on very small skiffs with 3 or 4 fishermen on it. For us, I'd love to bring in, big multinationals to come in and have their corporate venture programs. But, the young Omani fishermen first need to be educated on on what sustainable fishing looks like. We work with the IPNLF, the International Line and Pole Fishing Federation, right? They are the NGO that's actually on the ground. This isn't corporate venture. This is not very fancy venture capital discussions and PowerPoint slides, but literally sending a team over there to film what the current supply chain looks like and how much, how a little bit of technology, but sometimes just a bit more coordination can actually help bring that product to market. And if you don't see that value trickle down straight away, and it is dollar on dollar, you have to give these fishermen more money, then that project will fail because tomorrow they'll go back to their own old ways. And I think for us as a firm, we have great investors that understand those challenges in being in the Middle East. We have predominantly Middle East investors because they understand what emerging markets are like. International VC looks at us and says, well, how can you prove that everything is sustainable? I said, we don't even know what is being caught. Like, let's start at the very basics, and then we'll talk about how we can get to sustainability and impact, right? So just to be a little bit, realistic on what it takes when you're trying to sell a technology product, but your infrastructure, Francisco, as you said, is very, very basic, becomes an extremely difficult story to tell when you're out there and you're trying to grow a tech business with double-digit growth every month.
Yeah, I think we're saying very similar things, if I might jump in here. And I'm actually, my day job is working with working for a number of startups. In fact, my first trip to Oman was with Blockchain Labs for Open Collaboration. I think I was focusing on that type of localized consortia that you've actually built out. That is what's really necessary. So I'm not speaking from high level anything. It is really from my experience, not only helping startups in their programming, but for the last 5 years, I've actually worked as CSO and CEO for a number of startups, including in the oceans field and fishing areas and food chain areas. So I absolutely agree. And I think this top-down perspective is from having that localized experience, especially in emerging markets. And I focus also on LDCs. And this is where the technology has to be integrated with legacy, the legacy landscape. And that legacy landscape is exactly what you're talking about. It's the fact that it's very small scale. In some of the areas that I've worked in, they only have, they don't have smartphones, they just have mobile phones. So making sure that technology fits that provenance was the first one that really sort of integrated with legacy technology and understanding very locally the farming issues. And then what I'm saying is that actually once those small systems built out and the little consortia, the powerful but small consortia that you're doing, the education, all of that can build up. And that's where the support from programs and initiatives that I'm working with as well can actually be of help. And I think it is important that they understand that this isn't plug and play, that it is hard graft, and it is about really understanding the value chains and the actors in those value chains. And sometimes as a startup, you have to start in a very small sort of demonstrator approach and build it from there. And that seems exactly what you're doing. So congratulations.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
So there's tiers to the issues, right? There's tiers to the challenges, there's tiers to the risks. We have multinationals that are very quick to jump on and greenwash the hell out of what they're doing. And we have emerging markets that are starting not at square zero, but -3, really trying to build that up. So in both of these cases, what role can policy play? What role can regulation play? And if that's an important role, what role do investors, especially those with any sort of impact lens in their investment thesis, what role do you play in ensuring that that is top of mind for policymakers?
Again, I'll take a crack at that. I'm coming to this with particularly the labor rights and human rights lens, first and foremost. So when it comes to policy, there's actually been significant policy innovations starting back with UK Modern Slavery Act, but now, more recently, Duty of Care Act in France. There's legislation in Germany that recently passed, and there's hopefully mandatory human rights due diligence that will be approved in the EU context. And I think that's where, you're forcing multinationals and brands to understand who's in their extended supply chain, and they're required to do diligence on labor rights related risks. Now, the degree to which those legislations will have teeth, and the expectations in terms of the types of information that will be reported are still to be sorted out. But I think those are all positive trends. We've also seen a lot of positive developments in terms of changing corporate behavior through withhold release orders that have occurred as a result of some of the issues that have to do with Uyghur forced labor in China and in Xinjiang. And even when just a few shipments are held up, all of a sudden every corporation wants to know what can they do to ensure that their shipment won't get held up. And so I think you've seen other parts of the world also begin to look at those types of tools. So I think those are all positive in my mind, that in terms of at least with respect to labor rights, there are certain things that can be done that will force companies to further prioritize and and pay attention and have to report on some of these things.
Yeah, picking up here on where Ed left, I think looking specifically from Latin America in the agribusiness value chain, there's been a strong policy towards penalizing financiers, whether public or private, that have not been able to guarantee that the product came from a non-deforested area, from an area that had invaded native Brazilian and Indian lands, or the practice what we have categorized here as slave labor in modern farming, which I think goes well fed. Now, the big trick that we've seen is this has not been able to curb deforestation at the speed that we need to curb it. And what we're seeing now is an opportunity with these voluntary carbon markets still at its infancy, that the economic incentive to keep the forest standing is higher than it is to knock it down to produce livestock, right? But this is something that is going on right now. But traceability plays a very key role, and policy advocates have heard through the financing mechanisms. Now, I say the local ones, but we're invested by the IFC, the IDB, these guys, and they've also been very strict on these demands, and then not to us, but across the board through other money managers. And I think that's a way to control the pressure, even if not at the right temperature, the necessary temperature, it definitely exerts decent pressure, and things have been on the move.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more complex, right? And I was really hoping that that this panel could shed some light on how to take things forward. And I think it's really important for potential investors that are interested in the food space to hear these types of conversations, right? To see that in the food supply chain alone, like there's so much opacity, so much risk, and an inability for us to really understand what's going on, that the challenges there are mixed across the, yeah, Catherine, please jump in. No?
I wanted you to finish your question first.
No, it was just kind of tying things up, because we've got just about 5 minutes left. So I just wanted to kind of tie up and summarize things, right? I think it's just a question of showing potential investors and educating those current investors on the complexity of the issues within an extremely complex value chain, and that there are challenges and issues to be solved by startups that are working on multinationals and in the West, and there are challenges to be solved by startups that are working in emerging markets that have completely different risk profiles and challenges that need to be addressed by those startups. And it's just a question of being able to dig in and understand that full context for investors, and understanding really what they can do, what role they can play besides the capital, and really be able to support within that startups market. wanted to give you guys just a 2 minutes if you have any remarks or anything that you think we missed in this discussion.
Can I jump in here from the startup's perspective?
Sure.
Very quickly. I think when you're building technology products for the food supply chain, you'll very quickly realize that you're either going to be product focused, as in like a food product focus, and then multifaceted in that product, or in a function of the entire food industry, right? So there's a lot of fraud in seafood, obviously. 1 in 5 pieces of fish that you eat is mislabeled or misdated. Those challenges exist in honey. Those challenges exist in saffron. We know this because people keep asking us to build trace products for them. But we're so focused in building out our product suite to make sure that we serve the seafood supply chain. So we've got a trace product. We have a marketplace where this stuff is traded, supply chain visibility, the procurement tools. Now we're looking at a freight management software to help solve it, because that unlocks a huge amount of that supply chain visibility. And then I think it was alluded to by a couple of our colleagues on the panel, the trade finance element becomes extremely important through that, which is how do you actually bank young Omani fishermen that may not have a bank account? And how do you actually allow that, they work on very different sort of cash cycles than large buyers, internationally. So I think that's the first part. Overlaying all of that, just to tie in your last question as well, is the regulation and the policy. And I can comfortably say that policy has been lacking in seafood for so long. And Ali Tabrizi from Seaspiracy created more of an impact than any regulator in emerging markets on seafood. The attention that we got as a company post Seaspiracy was really the big part. So there is a public role here for people to ask the better questions, for people to really question where that food is coming from. Provenance was mentioned a number of times. So that's where, from a startup's perspective and somebody really in there, I wish people would ask more questions that are being asked today about what they're eating and where it comes from and how that person has been paid.
I think this is so multifaceted, and you touched on some fantastic points. And I think we also have to frame this differently, in terms of startup versus corporate and policy versus regulatory, et cetera, because what I'm seeing is quite different from what happened 30, 20, even 20 years ago, that most of the global reporting that emerged from the human security agenda when I was a diplomat was very soft. It was voluntary, and you only have to report on what you want to report on. But we're starting to see more regular drivers that are asking for teeth, for actually proving. We have border mechanisms that are emerging around certain commodities. We could see that actually starting to happen with food as well. And what we're also seeing in the innovation and startup space even is labeling and climate. And, the startup I work for, Open Earth Foundation, is doing nested climate accounting exactly for this, so that we can aggregate data and actually find new financial mechanisms for startups. So, for example, with ClimateKit, we had a methane, one of the very first methane projects, and we had to actually lobby to create the methane category for agriculture in order to get that into the carbon markets, in order to get the financial mechanism in place. So this, when I talk about collaboration, it doesn't mean there's no business model in there. It's just that it's very multifaceted, it's very complex, and these startups do need support from multiple angles, but they are the drivers of this. And there are policy umbrellas and regulatory spaces that are shifting to support that. And we just have to know how to leverage that. And that's a big chunk of education for investors as well, in terms of understanding real meaningful business models.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah.
The only thing I'd add, maybe going full circle, I think this is a tremendous space for investors and angel investors. And as you've heard from the panel, the current tools aren't working. There are serious problems that exist. You're seeing increasing demand from consumers, from investors, et cetera, for better information about how things are produced. And, you still have voluntary supplier codes of conduct and social audits and multi-stakeholder dialogues as probably necessary but insufficient tools that people use to try to address some of these things. And, the state of practice within the corporate world is pretty antiquated. I think it's estimated like 5-6% of companies have visibility into their supply chain beyond the first tier. So there are, with those problems is tremendous opportunity as well. So I just would say, I think that it's a place where a lot of the conditions and also even on the policy side that we talked about are aligning such that there are going to be, I think, very investable opportunities that can make significant impact as well as, be financially very viable.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think with that, we are just out of time. Just wanted to thank you all and hope that this conversation continues and we continue to press forward on making our supply chain in food systems more sustainable, more transparent, and above all, just keeping us fed with food that we know. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and all the panelists for such an insightful conversation. I hope everyone has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. We have covered food traceability from possibly all angles and stages of the supply chain, so I found that very complete. We are going to take a 10-minute break before moving on to the second panel. So don't leave, just take a refresher. See you in 10 minutes.
Once upon a younger year, when all our shadows disappeared, the animals inside came out to play. Went face to face with all our fears, learned our lessons through the tears, made memories we knew would never fade. One day my father, he told me, son, don't let it slip away. He took me in his arms, I heard him say, when you get older, your wild heart will live for younger days. Think of me if ever you're afraid. He said one day you'll leave this world behind, so live a life you will remember. My father told me when I was just a child, these are the nights that never die. My father told me. Light a fire they can't put out, carve your name into those shining stars. He said go venture far beyond the shores, don't forsake this life of yours. I'll guide you home no matter where you are. One day my father, he told me, son, don't let it slip away. When I was just a kid I heard him say, when you get older your wild heart will live for younger days. Think of me if ever you're afraid. He said one day behind, so live a life you will remember. My father told me when I was just a child, these are the nights that never die. My father told me. These are the nights that never die. My father told me. When your legs don't work like they used to before, and I can't sweep you off of your feet, will your mouth still remember the taste of my love? Will your eyes still smile from your cheeks? Darling, I will be loving you till we're 70. And baby, my heart could still fall as hard at 23. And I'm thinking about how people fall in love in mysterious ways. Maybe just the touch of a hand. Well, me, I fall in love with you every single day. And I just wanna tell you I am. So honey, now take me into your loving arms. Kiss me under the light of 1,000 stars. Place your head on my beating heart. I'm thinking out loud. Maybe we found love right where we are. When my hair's all but gone and my memory fades, and the crowds don't remember my name. When my hands don't play the strings the same way, I know you will still love me the same. 'Cause honey, your soul could never grow old, it's evergreen. And baby, your smile's forever in my mind and memory. I'm thinking about how people fall in love in mysterious ways. And maybe it's all part of a plan. Well, I'll just keep on making the same mistakes, hoping that you'll understand. But baby, now take me into your loving arms. Kiss me under the light of 1,000 stars. Place your head on my beating heart. I'm thinking out loud that maybe we found love right where we are. La, 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 la,
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Now we're going to move to a set of products that can be traced back to a more homogeneous set of sources, but has seen a lot of growth and attention from investors. That is cellular agriculture. This panel will be moderated by Sonia Wayne-Mueller, partner at VentureSouq. Sonia, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lola. And thank you to everyone from joining from different parts of the world. I am beyond thrilled to be joined by these three amazing individuals. This is the last panel of Angel Rising, by the way, for this year. And we're finishing with a bang because we're going to talk about the frontier technology of cellular agriculture, aka CellAg. And so this is the one subsector of food tech that might be lesser known to many of you, but it is one that you should put on the list because it's very fast developing. And so I'm thrilled to welcome Patricia, Rodrigo, and Max, who are all seasoned founders for Patricia and Max and investors for Rodrigo. And we're going to do a deep dive and explore what the future of CellAg looks like. So before we start, I'd love for everyone to just take a minute and just introduce yourselves. And I'll start with Patricia.
Perfect. Hi, Sonia. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here again and really excited about this panel. So I'm sure everyone will learn a lot. So my name is Patricia Bubna. I'm the founder of 4 Billion Bio. We will bring the first premium beef, cell-cultured beef, to the market. And we've been around for, a little bit more than a year. And we have seen amazing progress really fast. And with that time also, we saw how consumer attitudes are changing, something I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. And the one thing that is really important in this space is to look at technical differentiation. And Orbillion Bio has the strongest team out there to do exactly that. And I'm sure, again, we'll dive into that as well. And yeah, happy to be here and talk to the panel about the newest developments in CellAg.
Amazing. I'm going to move on to the next founder on the panel, Max. Thank you so much for joining us. Are you joining us from the US today?
Yes, I'm in California. So just like Patricia. My name is Max Roy. I'm the co-founder and the chief strategist for Turtle Tree. We are a Singapore headquartered company, but our R&D headquarters is in California and Boston. So we have a quite large team in the US. We are a cell-based milk company. Our focus is really on how do we produce the most valuable parts of milk. And as you will probably hear, one of our early focus areas is lactoferrin. And lactoferrin is a protein, it's a bioactive protein that's got so many benefits around it. And it can be found in milk. So these are some of the things that we're focused on and looking to take to market. Just like Patricia, we have an amazing team. And Patricia does have a great team. We love these people. We're good friends. And we all work very, very much the same industry, but different parts of the industry. So looking forward to be a part of this panel today.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Rodrigo, tell us a bit more about yourself and where you're at in your journey these days.
I'm the spy here because I'm the only one who's not a current founder. I'm a former founder. So I'm a partner at Outside Ventures, which is a deep tech fund based in Europe, investing in European companies with a focus on food. And before that, I was a partner at SOSB, which is a 1 billion AUM deep tech fund that was one of the most active ones at some point, now probably not, but definitely the first in cellular agriculture. So I spent 4 years there, invested in 43 companies. And I'm not very proud to say that 2 of my anti-portfolio companies are on this panel today. So I met both of these fantastic founders, and I was an idiot and not invested in them when I had the chance. So very happy to be part of the group, and thank you for having an investor here. You're the real heroes, guys.
You are the real heroes. I totally empathize with what Rodrigo just said. And so I'm going to kick off. Angel Rising is about investor education, and a lot of people in the audience are curious about investing in this space. And we have Rodrigo on the investor side, and then we have the founders. So I do want to kick off by talking about Rodrigo, you first. Like, why sell ag? Why do you feel like this is an important space for investors to take note of, especially right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, I'm not a technical investor, but I do invest in technical companies. I think that the way we look at technologies like cellular agriculture is we're basically following the talent. We follow the best entrepreneurs that we meet, and we're trying to learn from them what are the interesting solutions for problems we're having nowadays, right? And if you look at the food space, and probably you spend a lot of panels discussing how many challenges we have. At some point, like 5-6 years ago, very smart people started thinking, okay, maybe growing cells is a good way to solve these problems, and then attracting more people, and then at the end of the day, investors like us decided, okay, maybe what they're trying to do is something that could have an enormous impact into the future. So I think that why investors should look at it right now, I think it's because it started to hit inflection points that would make these technologies become what we would call mainstream. Like for you, Sonia, and for me, like we've been in this industry for 4 or 5 years looking at this, and so this is not new for us. But we've seen the pain, we've seen the non-believers, and now we're finally reaching the point where founders like Max and Patricia can take these things to market. So in terms of like the why, from an investor perspective, I would say timing. It's the perfect time to be looking at this. If you're just interested in what are the solutions that can have a massive impact into the future of food.
Yeah, and I want to talk about kind of these parallels between whether these opportunities actually fit the VC investment model. But before we go into that, I just want to take a step back, keeping in mind that we have an audience of kind of people who are sophisticated with regards to this space and less so, and people who are kind of newbies in this space. So I would like Patricia and Max, just for you guys to explain what your company actually does, but in laywoman terms. Patricia, do you want to start? Like, if you could explain what you do exactly in like a couple of sentences that are, understandable by most people. Now, don't get too technical.
Absolutely. And for all of you, why Sonia is saying that is because I am a PhD scientist by training, but I also, explain to a lot of people what we're doing. And it's complex, but it's very easy to explain. What we do is we make real meat. So you all know about plant-based meats, where we're taking plant-based proteins and make something that's like meat. But what Orbillion is doing is we're taking cells from an animal and grow them outside of the animal. And that's a technology that has been around for several decades, but really hasn't come off maturity, of technological maturity, until lately, just because it's really expensive to do so. And right now, what we are seeing is that there are more and more technologies developing to make this cost-effective and affordable, so we can actually make meat without having to grow an entire animal. And as I always say, what we take from an animal is only a small part, and especially the price cuts are a small part. So we don't need to grow everything else, like hooves and feelings and stuff like that. And we can really get a product that the consumers crave. And if I may add one thing there, Sonia, with what for me the big promises of Cell Ag is that we can make ideal products. Food that is safe, that is nutritious, and something that the consumers crave without the restrictions of having an animal produce the same thing, where we never know what is it exactly.
And you are taking these cells from live animals, not dead animals.
So there are different ways to do it, to get these cells. You can get them from a fertilized egg. You can get it through a biopsy, either before or after slaughter. So there are really a variety of ways to do that, and a varieties of technologies. And it really depends on what the consumer wants in the end, on which cells you're taking. We, for example, we have non-GMO cells. For some consumers, that's important. For others, it's not, right? So that's also the beauty. You can really tailor it to what the consumer needs.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for explaining that in terms of we all understand. Max, good luck to you. Can you please do the same?
I know I can't. Patricia is amazing when she describes this stuff, but I'll do my best. So with Turtle Tree Labs, we are able to harness the cells, the mammary cells that are inside of an animal, say a cow, and we're able to put them into an environment where they can secrete milk. At the end of the day, we're also trying to take that process that happens inside of a cow, put into say a tank with those cells, and able to get them to secrete out what the target proteins are. And for us, what you will see coming out from Turtle Tree as we move forward is we're focused really on the type of proteins that have a lot of health benefits around it. We are very close to UC Davis here. We work very closely with the milk teams to look at what are the most valuable parts and trying to build a very strong case around why these proteins are valuable for human nutrition. And the type of B2B2C model that we have, we really look forward to taking our products and marrying them with other types of plant-based and whole products that are currently out there. So that's what we're doing.
Well done. You didn't use any word that had more than 5 syllables, so well done. All right, so I wanna, Patricia, you mentioned your friendly cousins in the plant-based space. And so I do wanna address that because the perception, I guess, perhaps from kind of maybe the wider mainstream investor community is that the path to commercialization for plant-based products is one that is faster. And you know, some would argue that maybe we're not seeing more mainstream investors coming into the space because it doesn't really fit the kind of the VC kind of 10-year investment model. And so I mean, Max, you guys just raised, you know, last year, I think, what, $30 million in your Series A, which is incredible. And Patricia, you know, you went through YC. We invested in you guys, full disclosure, at the pre-seed level, but, you know, then you went on to YC and you've raised on a couple of rounds after that also. And so I'd like to ask you both first, and then Rodrigo, feel free to chime in and agree, disagree with respect always. You know, what was it like kind of fundraising for each of you? Because, you know, it's different when you're pitching to an SOSV, right? I mean, you're pitching to someone like Rodrigo as humbly as he's saying he's not a technical investor. He's the first person I went to when we were diligencing Orbillion, where I was like, Rodrigo, like, would love, you know, your eye on this company because on the technical side, because I need a bunch of kind of PhD eyes to look at this. So, you know, how did you go about your fundraise journey, both of you? Who did you approach first? And what kind of diligence? I mean, you know, what I tell entrepreneurs is we're diligencing you. You should diligence the investors that you're talking to as well. Like, what kind of diligence did you do when you looked at kind of crafting that perfect cap table? Whichever, Max or Patricia, if you guys want to start, and Rodrigo chime in. Yeah.
I think in the early days, just like most entrepreneurs, you're talking to everybody because you're trying to understand the field. You're trying to understand, you know, where do you fit, which investors you think you'll work best with. And at that point, as many investors as possible, you're just trying to figure it out. But at some point, you raise your first round, you know, and you start learning a lot more about which investors are going to be a better fit for you. You also start understanding what type of risk profile these investors are looking for as well. Some of these investors were really heavily focused on plant-based. They understand that that market is quite mature, that they're looking at a product right away, and it's a very different path. And other investors are a little bit more focused on IP, and they understand it's going to be a little bit longer, but they are expecting that there will be some type of protection there around a moat of IP that they can actually bet on. So there's no wrong way. It just really depends on what the investors' you know, focus area is.
But just to chime in here, but Max, like, what's interesting about you guys is that you have one foot in the US, one foot in Singapore. Singapore has kind of positioned itself as, you know, very much a pioneer now in accepting that the space is reality, or the new reality that we're going to live in. And so we'll get to regulation in a bit, but I think it's worth, you know, us talking about a bit later on the panel in terms of, you know, Singapore versus the rest when it comes to regulation. Patricia, do you want to jump in terms of your own fundraising? I mean, you accepted money from us at VentureSouq, definitely not technical advisors, but I guess something vibed between us that you accepted us on your cap table.
Look, Sonia, that I don't know how to describe it better than, we're a technical founding team. We need a lot of things, but not technical advice. Yeah. So we need everything else that you were able to bring in, that other investors brought, right? Also the YC program. And you actually believed in us before YC funded us. So, these early stage investors that are really convinced because they see a team that's passionate, that has the technical background, and where they see the potential that they execute well. Because having an idea is great, but can you execute it, right? And that really is the belief that you need to establish. If you have a team that's very technical, but is not passionate or doesn't understand that what they do is making a consumer product and it's not an R&D experiment, that don't understand where their gaps are and where they need help, right? I think that's a problem. And I would like to circle back to what you said about plant-based versus cell-cultured products. That's a huge difference, right? On one end, we're looking at a consumer product that, as you rightfully said, can go to market really fast. And there's a lot of potential, right? But as soon as we see more cell-cultured products entering the market, there's the huge advantage that you have products that are the real thing, but for example, in terms of cell-cultured meat, are better than original meat. They're more sustainable, are more easily available for countries that do not have the ability to grow a lot of livestock, makes them independent of imports, and so on. So there's so many benefits. And the other thing is, if you look at cell-cultured companies, you need to look at them more like at deep tech, biotech, maybe even biopharma companies, but I always say, with the upside that we don't have to go through clinical trials, so no chance that we're failing in phase 3. And the really important point to understand here is, yes, it is a longer time horizon. And I would be careful with any promises of companies that can say, yeah, sure, we can do that in a year. But that time horizon is really typical of deep tech investments. Look at the battery space. I think always, it sounds weird to a lot of people, but compare it to the battery space where we see 10 years of R&D and then there are products coming out of really high value and lasting impact, creating a new category. And to have that vision and back founders that see that new world, that is important. So that's what we were looking in investors that are believers. I also look into diversity of investors. And what I mean by that is both, of course, people from different parts of the world, because what we're addressing here is a global problem, especially also female VCs in that sense, because for us, that's important to support that as well and get investments from there. And then have that diversity in connections globally. And that's also, I think, what Max and Frank Ru are doing really well, leveraging that global network. That's important in terms both of regulatory, where our products will be on the market, but also where our products will have the most immediate impact. And Sonia, we talked about that, the MENA region, definitely super interesting for all of us in this space.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, you also did a great job at kind of hand-holding us, in addition to, Rodrigo holding my other hand like a child, in terms of hand-holding us through kind of the technical diligence that we were doing as well. You sent us reports for us to kind of familiarize ourselves with the space, the competitive landscape, etc. Rodrigo, I want to pass on to you. You've been in the space for a while. How have you seen the space evolve? Like, do you feel like we're seeing some of the more mainstream VCs entering this space? And also the second question, which I'd like to ask you is, how do you see this fitting your own kind of VC model from a returns horizon? Because I think that's important to talk about as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of say something a little bit controversial, but get ready. A lot of people are going to lose a lot of money, but that's embedded in our models, right? For people that, are not so sophisticated when it comes to venture, they need to understand that because one company raises a lot of money and ends up not working out doesn't mean the industry as a whole would not work out, right? So I think we need to get ready to see these mainstream investors that probably didn't understand what they were getting into. And because, we were very lucky at the beginning to, fund some of the companies that grew really fast. and mainstream investors coming into the space not understanding, most importantly, the patient's part. It's like you need to be really patient with companies like this. Some people are going to try to, force founders to move faster or change the approach or even change the team. So I think we're going to see, in terms of your question, Sonia, and to bring something that is not so well known, is we're going to see a lot of these companies failing, right? But that doesn't mean that some of the other companies are not going to succeed, and the impact is going to be enormous. I think also that from a fund perspective, you need to understand, or like people need to understand how that the company that requires, as Patricia said, so much time fits their own model, right? Like traditional venture funds would be on average like a 10-year fund, with some years that you would extend them. Not every company it's at the stage where they can grow to the point that would make them a fund returner for that vehicle, right? And I know this is a little bit sophisticated, but again, to understand that timing plays a big part when it comes to highly technical companies. Again, doesn't mean that the industry is not going to succeed, but we will see some of the companies that, in my view, were funded by people that didn't know exactly what they were getting into, and because the space sounded very sexy, started throwing money at it. To your question, Sonia, how this fits our model, like at Outside Ventures, we have a traditional, 10-year long fund. So, for example, and it doesn't mean we're going to do pure cellular agriculture companies, but we'll make investments in the space. We won't be doing pre-seed, for example, in the type of companies that we're looking at. So it fits kind of the timing of our the maturing time of our fund. I think there's a very interesting opportunity for the people in the audience that are interested in the space, and the guys probably can tell a little bit more about it, to the adjacent industries to this, and like what are the choke points, where are the bottlenecks for the industry to really thrive, and is that the media, is that the cell lines, is that the bioreactors? I think like the guys are running amazing companies, but there are other new entrepreneurs in industries that are trying to solve problems that Patricia and Max have today that could be really interesting investment opportunities.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into one of the other questions that I had around kind of the current kind of challenges that you're facing on the founder side. If you were to identify kind of, obviously people have talked about regulation, people have talked about cost. What would be kind of the main challenge that each of you face currently as you're building your companies?
Well, I can say that we've been very fortunate to bring on some tremendous talent. This is something that we've been very fortunate that we've been able to do that. But some of the challenge that we see is infrastructure for this industry for the long term. If we look at the precision fermentation side of things, that GFI has mentioned over the next 18 months, tank space, fermentation space globally is just going to be tapped out. That's something that you have all of these amazing technologies and companies popping up doing dairy products and this protein and that protein. However, many of them are going to run into this issue where there's not enough tank space to be able to provide product for their customers globally or their respective markets. So I see that the infrastructure needs to continue to be built out, and that's not something that the startups themselves should be doing alone. I think that governments, like, for example, in the UAE, should be participating and are participating from what we know in helping to build that out.
Yeah, so you're saying like the nuts and bolts still need to be figured out, basically, in some instances.
And large-scale CapEx, a lot of large-scale CapEx is not something that startups should be taking on and should have to take on.
Yeah.
For just to add something before we move on to Patricia, Sonia, there, it's like for people to understand, it's basically there's a huge opportunity for someone to build the Amazon Web Services of this industry, for example, right? Like, and what Max said about governments being able to be part of this is actually fantastic from a strategic point of view, and like food security. It's a fantastic industry that really needs some other things to be sorted out, not necessarily by the startups themselves, because then it becomes less interesting for an investor if they need to spend half of their money into building a facility
Well, whose role is that, Rodrigo? Like, is that the role of a founder to be like, okay, I am going to go for this challenge and go all in and try to figure this out? Or do you feel like it's kind of a private-public kind of partnership type approach?
I wouldn't call it a challenge. I would call it an opportunity.
Okay.
And whoever can, capitalize that opportunity, good for them. I think there's a huge, there's a huge opportunity for sovereign wealth funds, for example. And I know a few founders that are actually building this at this moment. I have met them, at least 3 of them at the moment, and it's very interesting because it's a fantastic kind of new way of building infrastructure, right? These are not roads and bridges, right? Like this is a next level infrastructure that is going to change, from a geopolitical standpoint as well. How do we deal with food? So again, I don't think it's a challenge. I think it's an opportunity, and I would say, governments are at the forefront of this.
Okay, interesting. Patricia,
I second that. Yeah, definitely. There's a huge opportunity there in terms of infrastructure building, and in the whole. If we look at the entire capex that Max said, really important to build this infrastructure, because we now are, and I say that as a scientist now, we are at an inflection point where we know so much about these technologies and we are ready to scale. So I would say, give us money, give us the infrastructure, and we will scale that and bring the products out. And with that, I would say the biggest roadblock for us is, do we know enough about the consumer and what products they want? Yeah. Are we looking enough at the consumer? Do we understand them well enough? I think for us as founders to look at the consumer and say, what is it that they want to see from us is really, really important.
And so how do you do that? I mean, that's also a nice segue into one of the questions I had around kind of go-to-market strategy. Obviously, you're still kind of, some of you are still in kind of the R&D phase, et cetera, and you haven't commercialized yet, but how do you envision kind of your GTM, your go-to-market strategy in terms of, B2B, B2B2C, B2C, like what are you thinking? Max, I think I read something about how you guys were obviously kind of targeting the US, which is also why you have presence there, and you're thinking about it more from a B2B approach. If you want to chime in first, yeah.
No, absolutely. We have a strong presence in the U.S. around the R&D side. Our corporate headquarters is still in Singapore. We are still a very much a Singapore company. And when we look at early markets, actually, Singapore seems to be a perfect market for us. And that's where we will be launching some of our first products as we scale up, as there's a ramp up period and so forth as well. And one of the things that I think makes Singapore really attractive is the ability to launch product in a small market and learn more from the consumers that are out there. Another interesting thing about Singapore, as you guys know, cultivated meat has already been approved by a company, and they have been building tremendous data. And with that data, what they've been able to understand is Singaporeans are much more open than even Americans when it comes to trying and consuming cultivated meat.
And why is that? Why do you think that is? Because I mean, there is kind of this East versus West. I mean, Singapore is one, Qatar is another one here in the Middle East, where Just is launching a lab. Patricia and I have talked about this as well. Why do you think this is coming from the East?
I mean, listen, there's a host of different reasons for that, but I just want to highlight this is a country that has to import the majority of all food. They don't have farms there. The only cows they have there are in a zoo. So it is a true thing. So that's not something that they have the luxury of having. So I think the country promotes these type of technologies, and food security is a real issue. And I think it's the same situation in the UAE region or in the Middle East, where food security is an issue. There's not a ton of lobbyists there looking at how they could fight these types of trends that are coming, that are inevitable. But Singapore, it's a sophisticated society. They're very open to trying new things, and a lot of scientific grounding there as well. I think that just for multiple different reasons, it's a great market for TurtleTree to be launching our first products into.
Just a pointer, sorry, Sonia, to cut you. But I think that you briefly touched on it, Max. Like, there's a lot of interest groups in other economies where the fact that this could become mainstream would really affect their economic interest, right? So there's a lot of pressure. in countries where the meat industry is strong, as we've seen with milk and every other product, that it's highly concentrated in a few hands. And these markets are really interesting because they don't necessarily have this. So it's look, net. I don't think this is. No one can oppose these technologies. Like, it's so brilliant what the guys can do, and as soon as they put it into market, right? It's very interesting, I think, to as an investor as well, to look into companies that are trying to find the wedges in these countries where they don't have to battle these old industries and these people that are just going to push back. Sorry, Sonia.
No, great.
I disagree with that, Rodrigo, on a certain level, because it's not the meat industry that's for us somebody that opposes us in the US or in Europe, because Tyson, JBS, we saw JBS even acquired a cell culture meat company in Spain lately. They don't care who gives them their protein as long as they get it to a good price, right? I think it's more some political lobbying where there are some interest groups that are on a different level, right? One question that I get asked very often in the US is, oh, so are you taking business away from farmers? And then I explain that no, because there is actually an opportunity that I see that farmers will be the one that produce the value products, the value cuts, right? And we make the meat that's currently produced in industrial farming that's really not that nutritious a better product at a very affordable price. So
I'm gonna push back there. One-on-one.
That's okay, but just let me finish my thought there. And I don't know about Singapore that much, but we saw a good adoption there. And I think the MENA region again is another point where if you have the advantage that you say, like Singapore did, hey, we will offer you a regulatory pathway. That's where we very clearly say this, and that, and we have a good time horizon for you as a company, then that's where you will attract these companies and you will attract these industries to your country.
All right, Rodrigo. Here you
I'll
go.
buy it. Let's move on. Let's move on. I'll buy it.
You'll buy it? Okay.
Yeah, the farmers. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I'll buy it.
But okay, so with Patricia, okay, so just before we move on to regulation, like, or Billion's kind of go-to market strategy will be what?
Yeah, so this is going to be a new product. So we want people to be familiar with the product. We realized in something that we asked a lot of consumers on their viewpoint on that. It's something where you want to have a chef, a restaurant that you trust, prepare it, and familiarize you with something. It shouldn't be something that's completely new, like, I don't know, meat ice cream.
You have like chicken flavored chips in the US, I think, right? Like stuff
in that way, I'm still very much European. So no chicken flavored chips for me. But yeah, for us really, it's to create a product that people crave, that they understand, and that's being served to them in a familiar setting. That's, I think, the best entryway in the market. And as Max also said, being in a small market and really being able to dominate one segment with your products will be, I think, a great way to start.
And I think there's a level of education amongst the consumers that's needed as well, right? Like when we hosted a session for your co-founder in my garden in December, there was some kind of—
I was so envious.
Yeah, well, next time you come to, if you come to the region, I will host another session in your garden. Max,
thanks, I can't wait.
Same for you. But yeah, I think, there is a level of education that's required, and there are some kind of preconceptions that people have about eating, kind of cellular or cultivated meat, basically. Speaking of which, Rodrigo, have you tasted?
I was told I shouldn't say I did, but yes, I did.
And?
I'm not going to tell you from home, and yeah, pretty awesome.
Pretty awesome. Okay. Yeah. I haven't tasted yet. I'm waiting for my elk and my bison to be sent by Patricia one day, and my milk by Max Yeah, I think in general, I think we don't have much time, by the way, we have 4 minutes left, but I think in general, this is an exciting space. I think it's one from our perspective that we're definitely delving deeper into. I think, I hope at least that from an investor standpoint, some more of the mainstream investors come into this once they kind of get their heads around the playbook as well. I think, from what we've seen so far, it has been somewhat siloed. And that was some of the feedback I gave even to SOSV, is that, there's a lot of investors like me who are actually interested in investing in the space. We're just scared to, because we feel like we don't know enough about the technical side. And I think that's also where the founders have to come in and actually educate some of the investors to kind of reel them into the space, or find your friendly Rodrigo to kind of soundboard, some of what's happening in the space. It's moving very fast. So I guess my question to all of you, and I'll start with Patricia just to end. If you weren't doing what you're doing right now, what would you be doing?
If I weren't doing Orbillion right now, I think what I would be doing is investing in companies like Orbillion. No, just kidding. But I'm a scientist by heart, and I was always passionate about bringing scientific solution to real people, right? To make products that are impactful, that are helpful, that make a difference. I used to be in second generation biofuels because I care, and I think now is the time. And it's an urgent call to really make an impact as a scientist, as an engineer, in whatever way you can. So I think this is what I would be doing. If it wasn't Orbillion, it was something else that can really change the food system, help fight against climate change. These are the things that are really most important right now. And I encourage everyone to help this space in the way that they can, either by joining a company, by investing in companies, because that's the best thing you can do right now to really help generate rapid solutions for the most pressing problems on the planet.
Awesome. Max?
And
wait, Max, can you tell us also why Turtle Tree?
Sure, absolutely. So turtles and trees signify longevity of animals and the planet. My background, I was a CEO of a tech company for more than 15 years. So that's my past. So several years ago, after about a decade of complaining that nobody else was doing enough to make this a better world and do enough around climate change, I stepped down from my previous company and started this company with my co-founder. But if I wasn't doing this, it would be a different type of company, still around sustainability and still fighting working on these climate change issues, because this is something I'm really passionate about. And I want to be able to take some of my leadership skills and my abilities and find a way to be a part of the solution. And that's at the end of the day, that's what matters the most for me.
Amazing. Rodrigo, if you weren't such an amazing investor in this space, what would you be doing with your life?
Probably running a tiny restaurant in some town in France, but
amazing.
Probably. But besides that, probably working for some of my portfolio founders or people like Max and Patricia that are really trying to change the world. So I do feel I grab onto a little bit of these amazing founders' journeys when I invest, but I think it's better even if you work with them and you learn from them. So probably working for one of you guys or somebody else trying to do the same thing.
Amazing. We do have one question I'm going to take from the Q&A because it's one that I have asked Patricia in one of our first conversations. Someone anonymously asked, is this halal?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. We actually looked into this, did some studies and questionnaires. Right now, of course, there is an option to make cell cultured meat halal, but that is something that will be decided when the product comes to the market, right? There are still processes that need to go through. And I also have to say that I am not the expert on this.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting one, and I'm sure it's going to come up quite a bit because the halal market is actually huge. Wonderful. Yes, Matt,
if I can add to that in any way, very recently we did get a chance to spend some time with Her Excellency Miriam from in Dubai. Yeah. And this question did come up, and they do see a very clear path to halal for many of these cultivated meat products. And the same thing goes for the dairy side as well. So there are protocols and so forth in place to help make that happen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing it home with that last question. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. I know you're logging in from the US and London, so appreciate your time. Rodrigo, I look forward to seeing you very soon. And Patricia and Max, I will come see you at some point over the summer. But thank you all for joining us today. This was fantastic. I know there's some Q&As that are streaming in, but feel free to find them on LinkedIn or stalk them on Twitter. And I'm sure they'll respond. Thank you so much for your time. Have a beautiful day and see you soon.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Lola, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Patricia, Rodrigo, and Max for a wonderful and very insightful panel. I too will be patiently waiting for some meat and milk. So thank you very much. For everyone who attended, thank you for joining us today. And a special thanks to our sponsors, Soma Matter, the VentureSouq team, startAD team, and of course, all of our panelists for supporting Angel Rising. With that, we conclude this year's edition of our annual investor symposium, Angel Rising. We have tackled the timely topic of food security and harnessing food tech to address tomorrow's food challenges. Our amazing and distinguished panelists discussed everything from production to supply chain to data transparency and cellular agriculture. So I hope today will change your investment decisions as you look to enter the food tech space. startAD and VentureSouq have many opportunities that can support you on this journey. You can learn about our Conscious Investor Fellowship on our website and many of the other programs. Please, we ask you to fill out the feedback form that will pop up after the end of the webinar. And you can always watch the recording of both days, today and yesterday, on the startAD YouTube channel. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you next year in our 8th Angel Rising Symposium. Thank you, everyone.